to the cloud. Yep.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Just doing a bit of a sound check. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, I've just said to Julie, I'm beaming in from a Mexican cantina in Karaparan Beach, sitting in the back of their garden bar. It's the only place I can find some Wi-Fi down here and a bit of power for my computer. So if there is some feedback, let me know and I can just try and manage it the best I can. So yes, this is the seventh session I think we've had, or sixth or seventh, and this is to
You've just frozen, Stephen. Are you there, Stephen?
You're it, David.
Do you think he's coming back?
I'm just texting.
Not if he's sitting in a Mexican cantina
No.
off Karaparan Beach, he's not going to.
That was his first mistake, telling us that.
What we might do, Julie, is let's make best efforts to get Stephen back on. But if we can't, and it tends to be a bit difficult, I'm happy to step in and share our remainder of our time today. And maybe you can just hold my hand for just some of the preliminaries. I think we normally start off with a karakia to start with. I think we're wanting to hear from Ms. Mako and Ms. Hoko-Pauda today, and potentially or possibly Section 42A reply verbally, but I think that's probably going to be at another session that we're going to set out. And I'm just looking for a nod. Yes. So while we're waiting for Stephen, maybe we can just get started and he can join us when he can. How does that sound?
That sounds good to me, Antoine. Who's going to kick off with the karakia?
Yeah, I'll just look to our screen. I'm always happy to start us off, but I'll just look to our screen to see if we've got a volunteer or a... There we go. Well, I'll start us off. Hui anō he mihi kawana kia koutou, ko tai mai nei tēnei rā, ki te whakawhitiwhiti ngā kōru e pāna ki tēnei o tātou wahanga, he wahanga whakahirahira ki te iwi, nō reira he mihi kawana kia koutou ngā karangaratanga ko tai mai nei tēnei rā. E tūkuna tēnei karakia hi tīmata i tātou. So just like to acknowledge everybody who's joined us this afternoon, and we'll start us off with a karakia. Ko te pū, ko te more, ko te wau, ko te aka, ko te rea. Ko te wao nui, ko te kune, ko te whē, ko te kore, ko te pō. Ko te pō nui, ko te pō ro, ko te pō uri uri, ko te pō tango tango ki te whai ao ki te ao marama. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Tui a te kāwai tangata i heke mai i Hawaiki. Hawaiki nui, Hawaiki roa, Hawaiki pāmamau. I hono ki te wairua ki te whai ao ki te ao marama. Tūtawa mai i runga, tūtawa mai i raro. Tūtawa mai i roto, tūtawa mai i waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te kātua, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Stephen, I just thought we'd just start us off. So I just started off with a karakia, and if you can hear us, happy for you to jump in, or if you wanted me to just check because my connection's just a little bit better, a little bit in your hands.
Yeah, yes, Antoine, could you just stay on the best I can? Thanks for stepping on that. So Ropey here, so I'll just hand over to you for the afternoon.
Great. Hey, kia ora everybody. Good to see everyone. Well, I can't actually see you, but good to know that you're all there. Kia ora, Ms. Mako. How are you? Just as we've mentioned in the last couple of weeks, we've gone online due to the COVID disruption, and certainly I hope that you and your families are all well. I'm actually in day 8 of my recovery, and I just had a test half an hour ago because I wanted to have lunch with my family, and it was a negative test. So I've had my first lunch with my family for 9 days, which was quite lovely. No more room service, unfortunately, and back to the office. I got marched. So yeah, no more privileges, just lots of hard work to do. Good to see everybody. Perhaps we'll just go quickly around just to do a bit of a sound check, just to see if we can hear everyone, and we can also do introductions as well. Myself, of course, I seem to be working, and Stephen's a little bit disjointed today, so he's going to pop in from time to time. David, if you want to do a little bit of a check.
Oh, well, thanks, Antoine, and thanks for stepping in. That's appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Good. I won't bother reintroducing my credentials. I think I'm known to everyone now. I just note this is our 7th session on this topic, so getting close to the end, and lots and lots of notes, a whole full stack full. So looking forward to the rest of it.
Thanks, David. Sarah?
O tēnā tātou, I'm Sarah Mako te koteitanga o Te Atiawa. So yes, finally, 7th session,
Kia ora, Sarah.
presenting my evidence for today. And who decided 3 p.m. on a Friday was a good idea? I don't know, but
I'll take the blame for it.
okay, kia ora, kia ora.
I'm bright and cheerful, so yeah, I'll take the blame for the Friday afternoon. Maya?
Tēnā koe e te kaikomihana e Antoine o tira korua tahi hoki ngā kaikomihana o tira tātou katoa e hui hui nei te ahi nei. Ko mai we kaira hau, I appear on behalf of the tangata whenua submitters. And Commissioner Dash, the only point I've thought could be of use to you is if you do have headphone capability, it could be valuable for you to dial into the session. Therefore, even if you're dropping in and out in terms of your internet connection, then you can still hear everything.
Kia ora.
Let's go to Lauren.
Oh, oopsie, wrong Lauren.
Oh.
You go, Lauren.
Oh, sorry,
Wallace.
Lauren Morris. Sorry.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Lauren Wallace toku ingoa, counsel for the council. I too am self-isolating. I'm at day 7, so you're one ahead of me, Commissioner, but it's not fun having COVID. I'm here to assist with the right of reply, but it sounds like that may not be happening today, but regardless, I will sit in and listen to the evidence. Kia ora.
Thank you, Lauren. Joe?
Kia ora tātou, Joe Ritchie, Section 42A report writer. A bit disappointed to hear I might not get a chance to speak today, but that's okay. Be good to hear the rest of the evidence today. Kia ora.
Yeah, just on that, Joe, we'll see how we go.
Okay,
Yeah, if
I've
we
got some.
have the time and the opportunity, we'll definitely take it.
Sure.
We'll pass over to you, Maria.
Kia ora, Maria Hokoura for Ngāhui o Taranaki Iwi. Kia ora.
Thanks, Maria. Kia koe, Mr. Holswich.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Kia ora whānau. Everybody knows me. Let's get on with it. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got Marlene.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
Yep, we can hear you.
okay. Kia ora, it's just Marlene listening in for Ngāti Mutinga.
Thank you, Marlene. Sorry, Laura Jeffries.
Oh, kia ora everyone, Laura Jeffries here. I'm just listening in on behalf of Federated Farmers.
Great, thank you. We've got John Morrison.
Kia ora. I'm just listening in. I'm not really dressed at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon for formal appearance, so if you could just imagine me sitting here in a collar and tie, that's fine.
Fantastic, thank you for that, John. Lauren O'Byrne.
Hi everybody, my name is Lauren and I'm a policy advisor in the district plan team, and I'm the section 42A author for the historic heritage chapter, and that the rules in there overlap with the rules we have in the SASM chapter, so that's why I'm listening in. And apologies, my laptop does not have a camera, so that's why you can't see my lovely face.
That's okay. What a shame, Lauren.
Yep.
Glad you could come and join us. Ivan?
Yeah, hi, listening in for Heritage Taranaki, also in isolation. Joy.
Cool. Thanks, Ivan. And Aroha?
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, Aroha Chamberlain, iwi liaison lead for MPDC. Kia ora.
Tēnā koe, Aroha. So that's just introductions, and we've done a bit of a sound check, so that looks pretty good. So we'll, without further ado, Sarah, we'll pass over to you. We've got your the notes that you sent through to us last week, I think it was, early last week. So we've got those. So if you wanted to read those or however you wanted to present, over to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So yeah, in a mad rush and I was very, very nervous that day. So I threw a whole heap of those speaking notes together. So that's why you received them. But I guess this is the third time we've presented this week, I think. So yeah, began at the beginning and at the end of the week. But anyway, I just wondered if you were comfortable with both Maria and I presenting or being questioned, I guess, at the same time if we need to. But
that makes sense. There's a lot of overlap in the issues, so I'm happy for that to occur, and you're both there. So
yeah, cool.
If I get a nod from my fellow commissioners, we'll proceed in that way. Okay, that's great.
And you will have also received Maya's supplementary legal submissions as well.
That's right. I think. Well, certainly for myself, I just got those this morning, and probably the others. And I haven't had a chance to have a read of those, and probably Stephen hasn't either.
Yeah.
But maybe perhaps if you think it's worthwhile, we might just get a quick summary. If there's anything that's different to what we'd requested last week and what was identified, we can just bring that to our attention. But otherwise, happy for you to start with your presentation.
Yeah, so I think if we begin with Maria and I, and then Maya can come in the end if that suits you.
That sounds fine.
Cool, great. So I'll just I am going to read my notes just so that for the record anyway. Now I'm operating off one screen. So yeah, great to see everyone again, and glad everyone's on the end. Sorry, on the up after COVID. So yeah, many of us have been exposed to it to date. So I'm glad everyone's coming out the other side. But anyway, thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you. So just at paragraph 2 of my notes. So Hapu and iwi submitters have presented a large amount of evidence over hearings to date, including hearing 14 in relation to the importance of sites and areas of significance to Māori. In my opinion, SASM contribute to the unique identity that is Ngā Motu. These resources are scarce. Once they are physically destroyed or damaged, they are gone. However, their wairua and values continue, and the relationship tangata whenua have with those areas continue. Ms. Ritchie acknowledges in the Section 42A report that 40 SASM have been destroyed or damaged in the last 10 years. These are SASM that were known. This destruction is a constant reminder to tangata whenua of the Murumiti Raupatu and the ongoing effects of colonisation. Notwithstanding this, Māori are innovative and forward-thinking. We continually evolve and have the ability to reimagine, recreate and recontextualise these features and their relationships with them in a variety of ways. Some submitters to hearing 14, though they do not question the evidence for SASM, they appear to be of the opinion that the activities do not and will not affect SASM. Just as a reminder here, only tangata whenua have the expertise to advise on the impacts on and to those sites and areas, what protection of those SASM looks like, and what the relationship of Māori and our culture and traditions with their ancestral lands and wahitapu look like. I agree there may be merit in non-regulatory approaches to the protection of SASM. However, I do not support this as the only mechanism and expect non-regulatory methods to work alongside regulatory methods as a full suite or palette, as Maya's detailed in her legal subs as well. to be effective and efficient in achieving the purpose of the RMA, including sections 6E, 6F, 7A and 8 matters and the strategic direction of the proposed district plan. Now, this is probably a bit of tongue in cheek in this paragraph 5. So I've just made mention of the whakatauki waiho mā te tangata e mihi. So you have heard from some submitters to date around their engagement with tangata whenua, and just wanted to highlight that some of that engagement has been overstated. And particularly, I guess one of those points was in relation to so you heard from Paranini Hiki Waitotara. So one particular submitter to the proposed district plan actually opposed the return of confiscated whenua to Paranini Hiki Waitotara. So merely on a Friday afternoon, just highlighting there's some overstatement in the engagement processes. So paragraph 6, as Marlene highlighted a couple of weeks ago, I understand tangata whenua have applied caution and reason in the mapping of the extent of SESM. On many occasions throughout these hearings, particularly hearing 14, you have heard that the extent of SESM from a tangata whenua perspective is much greater than what has been mapped. However, these extents are often restricted by the archaeological record. As first traversed in hearing 1 and then in hearing 4 in particular, in my opinion, the archaeological record is never complete. For this reason, the policy direction of SESM must remain broad to apply to all SESM and to enable those SESM that are not scheduled but known to be protected. In her right of reply for hearing 13, I heard Ms. O'Byrne indicated the policy direction for historic heritage, specifically for archaeological sites, should apply to scheduled sites only. This, I understand, is on the basis that most archaeological sites are known. You have heard to this hearing from Ngāti Rāhiri, it refers to this morning, obviously that was a couple of weeks ago. You have heard from Ngāti Rāhiri regarding the discovery of an unscheduled site on Epiha Road, which Hapu knew was there. Of great significance to Ngāti Rāhiri, I understand on an archaeological level as well, this rediscovery is also significant. So there's two, now actually getting to my hearing 14 evidence. So there are two main points of my evidence that I wanted to touch on. The first, which I understand will be required to be addressed through a later process, is that sites and areas of significance to Māori are interconnected, together with other natural and physical features form part of the cultural landscape for each hapu. Whilst I understand scheduling of SESM is the most common way of enabling a rule framework, the downfall with the mapping of extents and scheduling of SESM is, in my opinion, they become treated individually instead of as a complex of features on a landscape level. I understand this is an approach applied to archaeology as well. The second point I wanted to touch on was my recommendation of the new rule framework and the same rules needing to apply in all zones. There's no mystery of what we need to do in order to protect SESM and the relationship of tangata whenua with our important sites, our culture and our traditions. In my opinion, transferring the Plan Change 40 rule framework to the PDP will continue to cause the unjustified destruction of SESM. At paragraphs 46 and 47 of my evidence to hearings 13 and 14, I highlight areas in which those urban SESM and archaeological sites, which could be compromised by the rule framework proposed in the Section 42A report. Now I have just here, I've obviously provided a PowerPoint as well, highlighting those sites which I've listed in my evidence. So I'm happy to go through those now if we need to, or after this if you want me to carry on, Commissioner Coffin, whichever you would prefer.
I'm just thinking we're on a bit of a roll, so you can go through your presentation now. This
presentation? Okay, cool. Right, so I'm just operating off one screen. I haven't printed everything. So this one is in those paragraphs. So you've got Tapuido here, which is just the site and area of significance to Māori that's identified on the top part of the screen. So where that is located is its zoned residential environment area. And you would have heard in my my evidence, numerous pieces of evidence in relation to the Somerset development, which is on the property, I guess, adjacent to where the overlay is. So that was just highlighting that potentially there could be development right up to the extent in the residential environment. And I guess that's, yeah, in my opinion, there were some poor outcomes that have resulted out of that rule trigger under the operative district plan. So that rule trigger in relation to residential has been rolled over into the proposed district plan. Yes, next, thanks, Julie. So this one is Whakawhitiwhiti Pa. So this is, I understand, is one of the best remaining pa with its trenches still in Ngā Motu. So this one here as well is the top of the pa has been, the extent has been mapped, but I understand from discussions with Ngāti Te Whiti and Ngāti Tairi that obviously the pa extent was much greater than that. So this Whakawhitiwhiti is the SESM that's marked number 16. You've also got, I think it's Oawai Pa or Oranga. Actually, if Ivan's on, Ivan might be able to confirm, which is number 720. And so for Whakawhitiwhiti and for Oawai or Oranga, they're both within the residential environment as well. So in terms of the rule triggers for Whakawhitiwhiti, so site ID number 16, subdivision of that land would be considered a discretionary activity, but potentially someone could build, a building could be constructed to the extent of Whakawhitiwhiti Pa as shown there. And we as I said this earlier in the week, we as in Te Koteitanga and the relevant hapu or ngā hapu o Te Atiawa are considering a pre-application for a subdivision on Whakawhitiwhiti Pa at the moment as well. Cool, if you go to the next one, Julie. Thank you. So this site is Maungaroa. So it's Maungaroa was gazetted through the treaty settlement process as well. So with the renaming of significant sites through that process. So it is known as well as Windy Point. So Maungaroa, this area, the front part, the northern part of Maungaroa is zoned under the proposed district plan open spaces zone, and the southern part is zoned residential. The southern part and what the area that wraps around to provide access to South Road. So a subdivision would be considered a discretionary activity, but potentially a building again could be constructed right up to the boundary without requiring resource consent. Up to the extent of the SESM could be constructed without resource consent. I guess acknowledging that it could trigger the underlying zone rules as well, but in terms of the SESM, it wouldn't necessarily trigger any rule requirements there. And next, Julie, please. This is actually one that we discussed earlier in the week with Commissioner Dash and Commissioner Littlejohn. So this area is known as the Waipu Lagoons, so of great significance to Puketapu, and the area around the lagoons, part of it. So on the far left-hand side of the image, you have the Links development. In the middle, you have whenua that's owned by Paraninihi ki Waitotara. In the middle, with the hatched blue over it, where the extent of the site and area of significance to Māori is that I understand Radio New Zealand land that's currently for sale, and that piece of land is zoned an open space zone under the proposed district plan. And then the whenua around Waipu Lagoons to the sort of the southeast, is zoned residential where the indicative road is coming through. So yeah, potentially development or buildings constructed right up to the mapped extent of the Waipu lagoons there. Next, thanks Julie. Thank you. So these are two sites that are within the Area Q structure plan. So again, probably two sites we'll be talking to next Tuesday and Wednesday. So 2048 on the bottom of the aerial is Hawi Taone. And to the north is actually another PAR site that is still retains its features as well. So Otu Wita Wita at 502. And so both of these are zoned under the proposed district plan, would be zoned residential as well. Cool, thank you, Julie. And then I think this might be the last one. This one is just highlighting Orwai Marae, so Manukori Hipa. So within this extent of, or the whole extent through the middle, which is has Manukorihi Road running to the west. So Manukorihi Pa, and then just to the bottom of the picture, there's also, it's sort of a square shape, is Kai Piki Pa. And again, the whenua where it's showing an indicative road to the bottom part of the aerial is proposed to be rezoned residential under the proposed district plan. It's currently, I understand from memory, I think it's rural at the moment. So potentially, again, buildings could be constructed up to the extent of the SESM without requiring resource consent. Subdivision would be discretionary as well. And that was that. Were there any more, Julie? Oh, okay, one more. And this one, the site here, number 2, site ID 2614 is it is scheduled in the proposed district plan as Hau Toki Nui, and it's a PAR. My understanding from discussions with the hapu was that it was an occupation area. And so this whenua here, actually, just to highlight, is owned by Te Koteitanga o Te Atiawa as well. Cool. Thank you. So were there any questions on just that before I'll carry on, if that's okay?
I'll just check in. Looks like we might be just carrying on, and we'll ask questions at the end. Okay.
Goodbye. Thank you. Oh, so just to mention there on the paragraph 9 as well, as after my debacle with hearing 13, I just prepared a diagram to show how the rule framework I had proposed in my evidence matched up to the Section 42A recommendations. So obviously I haven't included the permitted conditions or the matters over which discretion is restricted in that diagram, but it was merely just to show how I had matched them up. And then so just paragraph 10. So as I've mentioned earlier, there is no mystery of what is needed in the protection of SESM and why they are worthy of protection. We are now in 2022, this second generation plan needs to be that. Enable innovative consenting and not just be a first generation plan with a cherry and a couple of sprinkles encouraging not more than just the status quo. Nō reira. That was my presentation for today. So happy to take any questions, or if you want Maria to speak and then we question together. Kei a koe.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I might just pause there, see if we do have some questions. David?
Yes, can you hear me all right, Anton?
Yep.
Good. Ms. Marco, I wondered if you could just take us through that diagram, because I think it really nicely summarises the main relief that you seek at the rule level, at least. I've got
Sure.
it in front of me on my second screen.
That one?
Yes.
That one,
thank
yes.
you.
That's the one.
So what I'm seeing is a rationalisation of several rules and down into 7 rules. First clump relating to buildings, the second to earthworks, and the third one to subdivision and destruction. Is that, have I got that right?
Yes, yes. And the rationalisation is, I guess what I spoke to earlier, is that the rules, the same rules should apply irrespective of the zone.
Right.
Because at the moment, how the section 42A recommendations is that there's different rule triggers in relation to the extent of the scheduled SESM.
Yes. Yes, and that's really a fundamental of the overlay system, though, isn't it? That regardless of the zone, if there's an overlay present on the site, then those rules will prevail regardless of the zone.
Yeah, and so I guess the key thing is that the SESM, and I guess applicable to the archaeological sites as well, is that there's this notion that in the urban environment, given what came out of Plan Change 40, is that it's actually okay to build up to the extent of SESM in archaeological sites within the urban environment, but in the rural environment it's not. So I guess what through that presentation is what I've just tried to highlight is that in my opinion, I don't think that there should be a differentiation between the urban and the rural. I think the urban zones and the rural zones, I think it's been described as, but yeah, rural or non-urban. I think the rules should apply irrespective of the zones.
Yes.
The same rule framework.
Okay.
I guess another key point here is actually while we're on this tab here, is, and I guess we had that discussion, we've had this discussion at hearing 13 as well, as if around land disturbance, earthworks and cultivation, and if something doesn't constitute land disturbance, does it then constitute earthworks? So what I've also done in the rationalisation of the rules is I've actually I've proposed that the earthworks rule is removed and it's covered off by rule R1 there.
Yes, and that's that's the same approach that you've took in the historic heritage approach with the listing of 6 or 7 activities, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Just while we're on that, what's your view on, because the original wording of that rule, if I go way back, bear with me. One. You might recall right back at the beginning of these hearings on hearing 13, I asked whether cultivation was part of land disturbance or whether it was part of earthworks. Do you have a view on that in terms of a definitional response? It's something that Ms. Ritchie is going to report back to us on in her right of reply.
Hi. You can just bear with me. I will just open my evidence as well. I think I have set it out in there.
I think it's on page 13 of your evidence, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you.
Around paragraph 51, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, just thinking back to hearing 13, we did have and had a discussion around whether or not cultivation did permanently alter the profile, the contour or height of the land. And I mean, I understand that there are new technologies as well. And with respect to cultivation, and I guess the example that we gave, that I spoke to in hearing 13 was Mahuetahi. It's a par site just between Bell Block and Waitara, where you have the urupa, or what I guess part of the urupa is fenced on the top of the pa, and cultivation happens right to the boundary of that urupa. So it's the ongoing disturbance as well of the SASM. But in terms of your original question, I guess that's why I've tried to, that in that drafting, that proposed, that recommended rule, and actually specified that cultivation should, it is a permitted activity unless it's on the extent of the par site.
Or within 50 metres of it.
Or within 50 metres.
Yes. So in arriving at that recommended rule in your SASM R1, is there a degree of practicality, and well, I don't want to use the word compromise, but have you sort of adopted a degree of practicality there in respect to cultivation?
I think so. I think the plan is if it's not covered in this rule, the plan is essentially silent on cultivation.
Yes.
And I think we've traversed that over a few hearings as well.
Yep. I guess what I really wanted to, I know I'm asking some detailed questions, but I wanted to stand back and ask about whether there should be a different approach at both the policy level and the rule level to the sites that are subject to scheduling and the extents associated with those sites, or should it be one size fits all?
I think that there is definitely benefit in a site by site, case by case approach. I think that is a massive amount. That would be a massive piece of mahi. And I think just reflecting, Federated Farmers did give a really good example during hearing, I can't remember if it was hearing 13 or 14 in relation to some mahi that they do in a different rohe in a different region. And I think there is benefit in having that type of approach, but I think here we can't have that, I guess, that sort of approach now, but perhaps in the future, definitely.
Thank you for that. In a more nuanced sense, what I'm trying to establish is that should the policies of the district plan and the rules that sit under it be different for the actual sites as opposed to the extents of the sites? I mean, should there be a different wording, a different policy focus for the actual sites themselves as opposed to the surrounds of the sites and the rules that follow? Because the plan seems to be predicated on that approach, and I'm just trying to get a feel for whether you support that approach, that differentiation, or not.
I guess a couple of things reflecting on that, or the first question you asked me in relation to the rule framework, and that those rules should apply. The same rules should apply irrespective of zone. And I think that there needs to be and that there needs to be the 50-metre buffer. That does also need to apply to all of those sites. Secondly, yep, I think a nuanced approach definitely would be of benefit to each site, and I guess that brings in the cultural landscape approach as well. But thirdly, should there be different policies? I really think that, and the plan provides that direction, in my opinion, that that's for tangata whenua to determine what is an appropriate activity within that extent of those sites.
Okay. I mean, my understanding of the way the plan was notified was that there was a policy of protection around sites, and that manifested itself in a non-complying activity rule for destruction. So there was a link between a sort of an avoidance approach of sites per se and a rule that applied a very strict test to those, compared to the mapped or non-default areas surrounding those sites, which had a slightly different policy approach and a different activity status. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether you support that approach or not.
Not to avoid answering your question, but I guess one thing that I had raised, and haven't got it right up on my screen right now, but around, well, what constitutes destruction as well.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair comment. Let's put that to one side though. Let's assume. I mean, I guess in the plain sense, the site's removed and it no longer has any basis for recognition.
Sorry, just to confirm, so are you saying that if sorry, could you repeat your initial question?
Okay, let me give you an example. In the notified plan, I'm working off Miss Ritchie's appendix here. Which rule was it? Rule. I can't find it now, but I thought there was maybe Miss Ritchie can help us. I thought there was a rule that had non-complying activity status for destruction of scheduled or listed sites.
Yeah, so my understanding is that came in following submissions.
Yes.
It was proposed following submissions.
Miss Ritchie, can you give me the rule reference for that?
Yes, there's actually a policy which is was a former, it was between former policy SASM P4 and P5, and the rule is now.
That's part of SASM PX, isn't it, on page 33 of your.
That's correct.
Avoid the destruction of sites or areas of significance to Maori unless.
Yes, and the new rule is SASM R21, which is on page 15 of Appendix 1.
No wonder I couldn't find it. Page 15, did you say?
Yep. You might have a different, it's at the very end of the rules section, the new rules section, right at the very end.
And it's, okay, 21, right.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's a non-complying activity.
That's correct at the moment.
Yes. And just help me, what's the policy reference for buildings and activities on the extent of a scheduled site?
The new rules,
yes,
Commissioner?
Policy and rules.
Oh, policy and rules. Okay.
We've got P something X for the destruction, and we've got Rule 21 for the destruction, and on the activities on an extent.
Yep. So there's a range. There's SASM P3, which allows certain activities that occur. Then there's a manage SASM P4, erection of additions to and relocation of structures, earthworks and subdivision.
Yes. And
And
they
then-
all use words like allow, manage, ensure,
Yes,
yes, as opposed to avoid.
that's right. The only one that has a void is the new policy,
Yes.
SASM PX for the destruction.
Yes, and then there's a range of rules, aren't there, that generally are discretionary, but there might be well, I guess they range from permitted right through to discretionary.
That's correct. It depends
Yeah.
where they are and what the
Yeah.
zone is. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, thank you for that, Joe. That's good. So what I'm getting there, Sarah, is a very distinct approach in the plan that has avoidance policies and high-level consent for destruction. And I accept what you're saying. What is destruction? But that's another issue. And then a more permissive and enabling policy and rule framework for activities that don't involve destruction and are involved with the extent of the scheduled site. So that's what I was talking about, the two different approaches that the plan adopts, two different pathways, if you like, policy and rules. And my question is that something that you think is sensible in terms of planning principles and section 32?
I mean, I think that there should be a different approach, but I guess, yeah, I mean, that the extent of the sites aren't 100% certain either.
Yeah.
And so there could be a different approach to that. It's case by case, I guess, and this is the rule framework, I guess, that we've got to now. But there are opportunities in those activities that are in proximity to recognise and provide for that relationship of tangata whenua with those sites as well. And I think a good example of that is Te Hono, is the airport as well. And also, I guess, in my experience to date, it has been that applicants, developers, plan users are starting to engage more with tangata whenua. So it's moving away from SASM just being the trigger for engagement, which it was under the ODP.
Sure.
And now, we have, and we've highlighted these examples, I think, through previous hearings as well. As a good example is, in my opinion, is the Brougham Street development as well, which is on Mawhetapā. And Mawhetapā isn't scheduled in the operative or the proposed district plan, but it does respond to the knowledge that mātauranga that Ngāti Te Whiti have shared with the developer in that instance.
Okay, thank you for that. That's a very nice segue onto my second and final question, and that's about the difference between scheduled and non-scheduled sites. And you've touched on it in your evidence and in your speaking notes today. And we talked about it, I think, last week also. And I just want to get your feeling for the approach, because it might be different from Ms. Ritchie's, and that is, as I understand it, there's an intention from Ms. Ritchie to have the policy speak to sites of significance without the word scheduled or identified in front of it. And that's intentional to from both a plan writing perspective and a resource consenting perspective as consideration policies, so that if there are unknown or sites that are undiscovered or unknown, and there's a need for a resource consent other than being a listed site, earthworks consents generally, then those policies could be triggered regardless of the site not being scheduled.
Mm-hmm.
And so firstly, is that something that you would support?
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
Definitely.
Great.
I think we probably traversed this in hearing 4 was the first one, and particularly in relation to earthworks.
Yes.
Which obviously earthworks is the main activity where we where we as Māori rediscover our sites.
Yeah.
So I think it does. I think the policy direction of the SASM chapter does need to be kept broad to enable where through those resource consents, where an activity doesn't trigger the rules in relation to SASM, but there's that broad policy to allow it, and making sure that that rules in those other chapters such as earthworks and subdivision and the zone chapters as well do trigger the consideration of the policy direction in the SASM chapter.
Yes, you might remember in respect to the was the hazardous substances hearing, you and Maria copped a few questions for me on that, and it was about the it came down to whether we're talking about sites of significance, initial caps or small S or whatever. So, and it's the same issue here. The other side of the coin is that the rules are clearly tagged towards scheduled sites. And again, is that something that you support?
Yes, it's the those sites that are known and are scheduled. Definitely. But definitely there's some that I guess the lengthy conversations that you've had with Dan McCurdy as well around that you know, well, what he expressed from his experience with Māori is that they do that we do have those stories, but they're not always backed up by the archaeological evidence that's sometimes required to enable them to be scheduled.
Yes. So the sites are not scheduled at the moment. Well, either there's a number of ways they could come into the plan, either through a decision through this panel based on evidence, through a future process, such as a scheduled process. And that's probably the only other two ways they could come in, or through the policy framework, through consents that aren't triggered by a scheduled site.
And I think the Schedule 1 process is quite, I keep reflecting on conversations we've already had with the hearing panel around the addition of new sites to the plan, but also an example that we touch on, or that I touch on often, is the Somerset site, where we know that the extent of tapuero, we as in Te Kotaitanga and Puketapu Tawhirikura, we know that the extent of tapuero is much greater than it is in the proposed district plan, and making sure that it's afforded that protection, that the PAR in the area is afforded that protection that it needs in the proposed district plan, and not always relying on that resource consent process to trigger it, because you know there are officers at the council who aren't going to be there for ever, and making sure that those who do come through the council do know that tapuero is much greater than its mapped extent on the 11th of March 2022.
Yes. You would have caught the end of the conversation that I had with Miss Waikaira last week regarding the evidential basis that's on that we're faced with, and trying to balance that with ensuring there's enough evidence to include a site, but also keeping an eye to the risk of not including that, and how great that risk is in terms of the risk of not acting. So that's really me, I guess, focalising the dilemma that's in front of the panel in terms of that balancing act, if you like. And so that'll go to whether sites are included now, or whether they're included through a first scheduled process, whether not part of the whether they're clearly within scope of a submission, but whether the evidence might not be as clear. Okay, just check my notes. I think that's there might be a couple of other issues I might want to pick up later, but that's all for now. Thank you for your indulgence.
Hey, thanks, David. And you've covered a number of the issues I was going to raise, so it was probably good that we had you go first. I suppose there's a clarification in your speaker notes here, and it comes from, I think, paragraph 94 of the section 42A report of Ms. Ritchie around the 40 sites that were damaged or destroyed. And the SASMs, I suppose I'm just looking for some clarification. Are they scheduled sites and areas of significance to Māori, or are we talking about a mixture of scheduled sites and known sites?
Sorry.
It might be it's in Sarah's evidence, but I suppose it's a question for you, Ms. Ritchie.
I'm actually not sure of that. The answer to that question, Commissioner. I'll have to go and check that out. My understanding is it came through a statistical report from the resource consent team. So I'm not quite sure of what was scheduled or not, but I can certainly try and find out for you.
It's a clarification. If it's easy to get that information, I wouldn't want you to spend hours on it. I suppose the context for that is that was pre-2007, as I understand, and that's what led to the new approach. That's right.
I think it's in the last 10 years actually.
Oh, okay.
As well, yeah.
It would be good to
under
clarify
the operative
that.
district plan, yeah.
Just the way it's written, it sounds like you could be referring to pre-2007.
Okay.
It'd be good just to clarify. Thanks for that. I've been asking this question of everybody, Ms. Mako, so I'm sorry for your indulgence. Here is your experience with the SASM program, and we've heard the hapu, and I think that was probably really useful because we had those people who established their own little groups, did their own research, have had engagement with the council on and off during a period of time. Their sort of levels of satisfaction would have been the learnings from that. So I suppose I'm asking you from a sort of overview perspective, just acknowledging that it's quite a number of iwi and hapu to be involved over a long period of time with, well, it'd be fair to say, limited resources. Now, what's your impression in terms of the program, and what might be some learnings for moving forward?
Patapai. I started with Te Koteitanga in July 2019, and so then the proposed district plan was notified us quite soon after that. So my experience in terms of the actual identification and scheduling of those sites and the proposed district plan is quite limited. My experience being to assisting hapu in providing resource management advice to hapu in respect of those sites which are under the proposed district plan. And obviously, you know, I've heard lots of their the issues that they have had with trying to get wishing that they had greater extents around their sites and areas. But in general, like, you know, credit to Joe and the past few years and Dan as well. The hapu already speak highly of Dan and Joe and of Ivan as well. They work, Ngā hapu o Te Atiawa work really closely with all of them. So, and sorry, that was a generalisation.
No, that's okay, because I think
most of our hapu.
It feels like you've been there forever, but it's only been 2019. So my apologies for asking that question. It was really just your impressions, and I think that was a fair response to that.
I mean, it will continue. I don't see an end to the whole program now, and it can only, you know, just as an example, one of our hapu in particular don't necessarily agree with the mapping of SASM, but they, after some heavy resource management advice, have succumbed to that. They feel that that particular hapu feel they should be engaged on every single application, which is, or not even resource consent application, on every proposal in their rohe, which, you know, I can. I appreciate that view, because there is a reality of where, you know, for example, earthworks, they don't always trigger rules, but they may result in rediscovery of sites. So I think the I think the Waihi Tapu Archaeological Sites Review Project has only added additional protection to what the plan provisions could, with the outcomes and the aspirations for our hapu anyway, could achieve.
Thank you. And I think Ms. Chamberlain, from her presentation to us, it seems a little while ago now, a few weeks ago, pushing the weeks, set out for us, what the program has been and what it's likely to be moving into the future. So we certainly got no impression that this was a, yes, that's done, tick, move on to the next thing. That was certainly an ongoing commitment of the council to engage with a number of groups over a period of time, both through the district plan review and future plan changes to identify and schedule sites in areas of significance to Māori. So there was no hesitation or lack of commitment, certainly, that we saw in that regard. So I think that goes to your point in terms of where you've come from and where you currently are at the moment.
Yeah, and those examples of, Keith gave the example of Ngāti Rahiri down at Ipiha Road. There still are rediscoveries happening all the time, even up at, not sure if I'm allowed to, maybe Ivan could speak to it, but Land Information New Zealand on Otu Mai Kuku, with the Barrett Street Hospital, which Tiko Teitanga presented to at hearing 13. They've had I guess in the scheme of things, quite maybe a small find of some hangi stones there, but confirmation to us that it is really special. Well, not to us because we already knew it was special, but to show to everyone else that there was that occupation there.
Thank you. No, Mr. Chair, Stephen, I'm not sure how your sound is, but I will give it a go. Would you like to ask any questions?
Yeah, look, I don't have any other questions. I'm probably more of a watching brief this afternoon. Certainly following the discussion, I'm on a better, gone to my phone hotspot, so that's a better connection. But it's getting a bit noisy here, so I think I'll come in by exception.
Okay, just raise up your hand if you need to jump in. Oh, that's great. Hey, thanks, Ms. Mako. It doesn't look like we've got any further questions for you, and we might pass over to Ms. Hokopaura.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I don't have any prepared speaking notes, but I'm just going to, I guess, highlight a few things from my evidence. So firstly, the resource management issue that this chapter is seeking to deal with is the destruction and or interference, destruction of and or interference with SESM. And I think that there is clear direction in the RMA around protection of historic heritage and the relationship of Māori with their land, sites, water bodies, ngā mea katoa. So obviously there's clear direction for that in the legislation, and in the Taranaki context, in our context, that history and that context is critical. And so I guess I'd like to respond to some of the earlier submitters having and the lack of acknowledgement of that historical context from some other submitters, particularly Federated Farmers. And I guess Ms. Potu at hearing 13 and Ms. King and Mr. Buttermore earlier in hearing 14, their evidence regarding the history, they presented evidence regarding giving that context around the history. And I'd like to reiterate that how important that is, because Muru Miti Raupatu, the confiscation, the perpetual leases, all of the these acts of colonisation have led to disconnection and disenfranchisement of Māori. And that continues to today. And so SASM are some of the last, in some cases, are the last remaining visual markers of tangata whenua's presence in the landscape. And so a lack of acknowledgement or potentially ignorance of that and the importance of SASM within the context of Taranaki and tangata whenua's history is, yeah, it's something that that the plan needs to respond to, in my view. So when viewed through that lens, the protection of SASM, scheduled SASM, in my opinion, is an easy decision. I guess there's the context there of the history and the reality of tangata whenua today, and then there's the planning and legislative direction there. So to me, it's my opinion that that's an easy, clear decision to make. And I think it's a bit, so when explaining to some of our hapu members why we're coming to these hearings and why we're presenting evidence, why we're having to push for this, there's I guess, requiring that iwi and hapu come and argue for the protection is feels ridiculous to a lot of tangata whenua and hapu members, because having to argue for I guess the point that, oh, please don't desecrate these really important places, it just seems like a no-brainer to a lot of tangata whenua, and I think to a lot of New Zealanders as well. It would feel that would be shared by a lot of New Zealanders. So and I don't think I'm telling you anything new, but I thought I think it is really important to reiterate that that SASM are some of the last remaining features that illustrate the cultural landscape of tangata whenua within their rohe, and it's not unreasonable to protect them. And I think, and council has an obligation to do this under the RMA. And one of the ways that it can do that is through the district plan. And Sarah has discussed the rule framework that's been put forward and has provided some of those visuals, thank you, to show how the rules have been refined to get to what was recommended by the tangata whenua submitters. I guess one of the issues earlier in the hearing that that was discussed was around, how are these sites protected, and how does council fulfil their responsibilities? And one solution that has been put forward by tangata whenua submitters, including Te Kāhui o Taranaki, was a transfer of powers under section 33 in terms of decision-making powers. And so there is the council has the ability to transfer the obligation, well, not the obligation, but the process of decision making for SASM potentially to sit with iwi and hapu. And I guess there is considerable costs associated with those processes, but iwi and hapu are often already doing that work. So, for example, Sarah and I are employed by 2 iwi authorities to provide resource management advice to hapu and to the post-settlement governance entities. And so I guess it's a little bit outside of the PDP rule framework, but I guess it raises questions around the appropriateness of iwi authorities having to invest money that was returned in a treaty grievance settlement process to deliver on council obligations under the RMA. And so I know it's a bit of outside of the field here, but it all feeds into, I guess, that context and the reality of tangata whenua and their engagement with resource management of SASM and the other important sites. The other last thing I just wanted to mention was around the extents of SASM and I guess link that back to the discussions we were having around cultural landscapes, because from a Te Ao Māori view, it's about the interconnections between sites and a lot of the SASM sites can't be divorced from the awa or the puke or other natural features around it. And so one of the kuia earlier in hearing 14 said I think she summarised it perfectly when she said, well, why would you draw only my head when you're talking about me as a person or a SASM as being a whole? Why would you just draw the head? And so I think it is a challenge for the PDP and planning in general, I think, to how that cultural landscape is responded to. But I think that I think that the acknowledgement that even though there may be an extent on a SASM, it is very likely that it will extend beyond that because of the way that tangata whenua view the world. Yeah, that was all I wanted to say.
Hey, thanks, Ms. Okopona. I really appreciate you, the effort that's gone into not only this hearing, but all the hearings and turning up to each of them. And I'm not sitting on all of the hearings, I'm only sitting on some of them. And so I know for you that it may feel a little bit like restating it over and over and over. So it is appreciated, because certainly for myself, this is the first time I've heard you talk specifically to this particular subject, although we did have you in the archaeological historic heritage hearing as well. So just appreciate and acknowledge the submissions that you've provided with us. We'll see if we've got any questions. I might just start us off, and I've got 2 questions. One is the question that I'm asking everybody, and I think you're the last person I'm going to ask, and that's, but what has been your experience or not with the SASM program? And my second one is you actually talked to it a little bit, and this is the relationship with sites that might not necessarily fit comfortably within the sites and areas of significance to Māori, because we have outstanding natural landscapes and features. There are other natural resources in the environment that are important to Māori, that those provide the context that give meaning to why a site might be important. So you might have a kainga, but every kainga's got to have a water source, and every kainga's got to have gardens, and every garden's got to be able to, you know, get the sunlight and etc. And has got to have the soils and So it's I suppose it's trying to find the balance between those things that give meaning to those places in the historical context, but are able to be managed in a way that's appropriate now, to dealing with things that might not have happened in the past, like subdivisions and residential urban types of developments, utilities, etc. So it's just acknowledging that it's a challenge, but if you had any further thoughts in that regard. So that was two questions. One was SASM program experience, and the second one's that interrelationships with natural resources and cultural resources.
Kia ora. So my experience with the SASM Waihi Tapu review is 0. So I began with Te Kahua Taranaki in August last year. So came in once the hearings were underway. So haven't had any involvement in the review process.
Okay.
In terms of the your second question around, I guess it's around that cultural landscapes and how to, and how that's dealt with. I think so. There's the. I think that all of the SASM, as Sarah mentioned, only tangata whenua can identify the effects on a SASM, and how they might be mitigated or remedied or etc. And so I think that it has to be a case-by-case basis, because for example, if there's a kainga and maybe only the extent of a SASM is limited to the archaeological evidence for that kainga, but actually from a Te Ao Māori perspective, it connects to the awa, it connects to this area which was used for gardens or for other activities, then I guess and that wider landscape is also part of the proposal, then there's opportunities for I guess, as Sarah said earlier, Māori aren't frozen in time back in 1840, and we can, tangata whenua can adapt and evolve, and we live in the same world as everyone else. So we're aware of technologies and modern living arrangements and things like that. And so it's not that we are wanting to freeze everything in a particular moment in time, but that we can respond to current needs in a way that also respects the mana, the values, the wairua of a SASM, and that wider cultural landscape. So that might be through subdivision design. You incorporate those stories of the connections between places, and I think there are ways that can be done. I guess whether a plan or a developer is open to that and provides for that is another kind of question, but I think there are definitely opportunities within that.
Sorry, I thank you for that. I did actually have one more question, but it's quite specific. There was, in your evidence, just towards the end of it, there was a couple of sites that you disagreed with the recommendations, and there was a site 2442 and a site 177. We've actually received some further evidence in regards to site 177 in previous, I can't remember if it was in this hearing or I think it was in the archaeological hearing. But site 2442, and remember, for your memory, it was possibly a terrace which was identified by Nigel Prickett some time ago. I just wondered whether you had any further evidence, because what we've currently received is Mr. McCurdy's evidence saying it probably shouldn't be included because we're not sure if it actually is a terrace or not, or whether it's actually a cow track. So it was whether you just had any further information about that particular site.
I don't have any further specific information. I was advised by Hapu that they wish for that to be retained. So I'm reiterating echoing their point of view there.
Okay, thank you. David?
Thank you, Antoine. Maria, I just have one question, and it's one I meant to ask to Sarah, but I'll ask you anyway. And that's the issue around destruction and demolition. As you know, the plan describes those, well, talks about those terms, but it doesn't define those terms. And your own counsel indicates that the case law on the matter is not that helpful. Do you think the plan should contain definitions of those terms for plan users?
I think that would be clearer, but I would query who gets to define that.
Yes.
Because arguably, if you are building on a SASM, then you may be destroying it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's contextual, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that only tangata whenua are able to determine what is destruction or demolition of a SASM.
I completely understand that. The difficulty in a legal sense is having certainty around the rule framework. And in this case, it's a difference between, I guess it's the difference between a discretionary activity and a non-compliant activity, or being permitted even in a non-compliant activity. So I just wondered, whether that's something that, well, we've got legal submissions from Ms. Waikara on the matter. I wonder whether we could have some input through Stephen and Antoine from Ms. Wallace and Ms. Ritchie, not now, but in their right of reply on that particular matter. Antoine, do you?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just waiting for hands to go up or heads to nod. I think that may be helpful.
Yes.
I'm just thinking, reflecting on my own experience. There are particular cases when you're dealing with historic heritage where that becomes easy, when the characteristics of the features you're dealing with are quite physical and can be described quite articulately. But when you're dealing with the nature and scope of the types of SASMs that we currently have in the plan, some have some archaeological significance, but they also have cultural significance. You've got a number of sites which don't have any physical features, but it's the context and the nature of the activities that occurred in the site which are important, and it'd be difficult to think of things that could destroy it.
Yeah,
I suppose the PAR site, I suppose, is the obvious one where you think of what's a destroyed PAR, and there are lots of examples of that occurring, unfortunately.
Yes.
But that's just one very limited type of site.
Balancing that against the need for rules to be certain, so there's no aspect of discretion or uncertainty as to whether you trigger one or another. I see Ms. Wallace and Ms. had popped up.
Look, I'm happy to prepare some legal submissions on that. I've got quite a list of issues that have fallen out of this hearing. So I guess I'm just keen to make sure that whatever I do provide is directly on point and is on value. So, adds value. So in terms of the legal issue that you'd like me to address, can you just sort of concisely state it?
Yes, I will. I'll attempt to. There's been concern expressed that there is policies and rules that refer to destruction and demolition,
Yeah,
that those terms are not defined in the plan.
yeah,
And when it comes to a cultural construct, as opposed to a built form construct with built heritage, so we're dealing with SASMs, which are a cultural issue, that it's less clear what constitutes destruction and demolition. Yeah. So, and we've heard just from the last witness that it can depend on a site by site basis as to, I mean, what constitutes demolition or destruction on one site may not constitute demolition and destruction on another. That's a very crude way of paraphrasing what Maria said, but that's what I was taking from her answer. Whether we need any guidance in the plan through a definition or some explanation, or whether we rely on the plain and ordinary meaning of the words on a case-by-case basis to determine whether rules apply or not. That's probably as concise as I can make it, Lauren.
no, that's very helpful, and I understand what you're asking, and I guess there's two issues there.
I mean, you could write a thesis on it, and that's not what we want.
But yeah, I mean, I guess it needs to be clear for the plan user, for council staff, and for applicants, doesn't it? Is, you know, are they triggering that rule or not?
On a plain reading of the plan.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep, certainly. Okay, I've got some thought to that.
Joe, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think I was aware that both Sarah and Maria wanted the definitions, wanted those terms defined, and we're wanting to, you know, see where that landed, and also that Ms. Wakaira's evidence last week spoke about you need to refer to heritage values, you know, the destruction or demolition of heritage values. But I did think that may not be applicable to SASM sites necessarily. So yeah, there was a question, there's still a question in my mind as to how we would go about that definition. Yeah.
Okay. You've just reminded me of something, and I'll just repeat it, but I'm sure it's not lost on you. It comes on from the hearing 13, and that was I raised a concern about the difference between partial demolition and additions and alterations, and I just wanted to make sure that was still on your list for reporting back on. I think I gave you an example of a Palmerston North example where the applicant thought that, or led legal submissions that the proposal was an alteration and addition, and the council took the view that it was partial demolition. The definitions in the plan didn't assist, but there were completely different policies and rule frameworks based on those two terms. And one was a restricted discretionary, one was a discretionary. So, and the policy approach was different also. So it may be that your plan's fine, but I just remember asking you some questions about that on day one of the hearing, I think. So I just want to make sure that's a live issue for you.
It's actually probably more a live issue for my colleague Ms. O'Byrne, but
yes,
because
sorry, it is.
Yeah,
of course,
but that's fine, because I think it is. We do have to determine whether we've got overlapping concerns in both chapters, because obviously they're supposed to speak to each other. So yeah, thank you for that, Commissioner.
Okay. Thanks, Edwin.
Okay, thanks, David. Anything, Stephen? That's great. Hui anō he mihi kawane kia korua tahi mō tuku kōrero I tēnei wā. Just like to acknowledge our last of our iwi submitters. That was quite a marathon, wasn't it? That we've had a few goes at it, and it's been really interesting. There's been some really interesting kōrero, both within the hearing itself and a few confidential sessions that we've had as well. So just like, again, to acknowledge the effort that's gone into the submissions. So it looks like, Joe, we are going to get to you today, unless I see any other interventions. No, the sky is blue and the clouds are white, and we'll pass it over to you, Joe. So just in terms of how we might run this last part, so Joe, you're just going to give a verbal reply at this stage.
Yes, I essentially have such a long list of things to refer to. I was wondering, and it's over to you, Ms. Wallace, as to whether the legal issues could perhaps be discussed initially. Yep, that's fine. If we can start with those, they're a group of the items that we were going to discuss. So I'll leave you with Ms. Wallace to go through those.
Before we go to that, because I just noticed Ms. Makaira just popped up, and I'd said earlier, and sorry, I forgot about this, but I just remembered, if there was anything in that legal submissions update that we just needed to be aware of, it could let us know. So perhaps that might be why you've turned on your screen, Ms. Makaira.
Yes, sir. Most of the points are just, you've asked me for particular things, and so I've delivered on those.
Yes.
It was just whether or not you wanted to have a discussion with me in relation to submission scope specifically for the deferred selection property issue and the proposed definition of significant public benefit. For the other matters, I consider that the points are relatively straightforward and therefore can be taken as read.
Thank you for that. I was multitasking as well, which is still a new thing for me. So I was quickly reading through your legal subs and listening at the same time, which was a bit of a challenge. But I think I agree with you in terms of what you've set out. How long, in terms of just the further information for us, how long do you think that might take?
I'd say the discussion could happen in 5 to 10 minutes, sir.
Okay. Well,
I'll aim for 5.
Very good. Thank you.
So would you like me to speak to that now?
Yes, please.
Certainly. So this was responding to the question from Commissioner McMahon about scope, and the other matters I consider are quite squarely within scope. So it's really just a question, because I do consider, having looked through the submission, that tangata whenua probably are relying on another submission point, and having made a further submission on that to be able to reach into the ability to say that a definition a further definition of significant public benefit comes within scope. So I did want to draw that to your attention in the event that you had any particular questions of me about perhaps that reaching in. But the point that I would have made, sir, is that the Heritage Taranaki have indicated that having cultural expertise in relation to the implementation of the policy is required. It's a matter that Te Kotahitanga supported by way of further submission, and my submission is that the implementation of the policy is exactly what we're seeking to achieve by way of clarity through a significant public benefit definition, which is that were we to leave it open-ended, then it would be a question at the implementation stage about, well, what does significant public benefit mean here, and would it incorporate giving life to treaty settlement aspirations? But in terms of informing the implementation of the policy, a further clarity as to the definition of significant public benefit in it, including treaty settlement land, comes within the scope of the Heritage Taranaki submission and the further submission and support made by Te Kotahitanga, and is supported by their broader submission on the TW10 overarching tangata whenua policy around their wish to protect, develop and use Māori land, and they sought an inclusion of treaty settlement land in that provision consistent with their culture and traditions. So in that regard, it's my submission that there is scope.
Thanks for that. We'll just see if there's any discussion or questions in that regard. Doesn't look like it. We'll carry on.
Right, that's the only other measure, or the only main measure I will draw for Commissioner McMahon's benefit. You draw your attention to the last page of the submissions, paragraph 9, where really where Commissioner McMahon has been talking about this idea of balancing the evidential basis for a SASM with the need to consider the risk of acting or not acting. And all I've done at paragraph 9 is note that in my submission, the points are distinct, but one builds on the other. So first one considers the evidential basis for SASM, and it's at the point at which that evidential basis is found wanting that then the 32 analysis around the risk of acting or not acting comes into play. And so it's really just a point of clarification. I do consider that's how the Commissioner has been referring to the matters. So that was the only other piece. Oh, sorry, Sue.
No, Antoine, I was just going to say I can respond very briefly to that and say that I'd read ahead paragraph 7 through to 8 and 9, and that's exactly the question I was posing, and I understand your answer. So I'm very appreciative of that response.
Thank you, Commissioner. And to assist in these ongoing questions you have about the evidential basis, I also, you'll see, added a more fulsome quote from with respect to the rule of reason issue.
Yeah.
So those are the only points I'll draw to your attention, and now hand the floor over to Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. McGuire. Thanks very much for popping up and just reminding me that I'd forgotten about that. Ms. Ritchie, and I think Ms. Wallace is going to start us off.
Yes, perhaps Ms.
That's
Wallace
great.
can start. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
Okay, so look, what I propose to do is to essentially just go through the legal issues that have cropped up, and I guess just summarise what my understanding of the issue is and what the panel is seeking some further submissions on. And if you would be so kind as to confirm or otherwise that I've got that right, and then let me know if there were any other outstanding issues, because I haven't been present at all of these hearings, so there may have been some others that that I have missed.
That's great, Lauren. What we might do is just get you to pause after each one and give us the look. Is that right?
Okay, sure. So the first one I have is the Environment Court and High Court cases in respect of determining mana whenua status, which arose out of the Mount Messenger cases. I think that was a question from you, Commissioner Daish, just that there is an obligation, or the question is whether or not there is an obligation to for the decision makers to make an assessment of that. And Judge Dwyer, his decision does have some discussion around that.
It's just really, it was more about that list in Schedule 3 of who the tangata whenua are, mana whenua are for each of the sites. And it's more the council's obligation to define who the mana whenua is. You might be struggling to hear me by the look of things.
No, there's just a bit of background noise.
It's right, Stephen. Yeah, so that's in Schedule 3. There's a column which has mana whenua, and then there's either 1 or 2, or maybe sometimes 3 hapu identified, and they're identified as being the mana whenua. So there was just a question about, does the council determine that, or is that something, certainly we've heard that from iwi and hapu submitters, something that they sort out amongst themselves?
Really, because there's some differences of opinion between hapu about whether they should go in the list or not. That's the decision we've got to make as decision makers.
Okay. Who should be included in that list?
So perhaps I could add something here. So just as a point of context, my understanding is that the Wāhi Tapu Review Project has always approached mana whenua inclusively, so that several hapu and or iwi can be included based on their different interests and associations in relation to any site, in relation to any site. And I think my feeling is that some iwi and hapu are not happy that there is no priority listing of mana whenua in those lists, and that it might be something we could consider to somehow refer to a priority mana whenua in the list. I mean, I hesitate to say how we would do that, by perhaps by underlining in the schedule that that a particular mana whenua, as agreed with the group of mana whenua in the list, would take priority in any application process or discussion around the site. So that is my sort of understanding about how those mana whenua lists have come through, and why there's, you know, usually more than, or sometimes more than one mana whenua on the list. So yeah, I don't know if I can help any further, but that's something, context.
Yes, and Lauren, just you know, we have to make a decision, a recommendation on these lists. We just want to be really safe around how we do that with reference to the most up-to-date law. And I'm not sure myself if, and we have some evidence, some of it is in that publicly excluded sessions about which hapu should be involved in relation to specific sites. So yes, just probably some process and some legal precedent advice about those issues.
Okay. The next issue, and does anyone have any other comments on that one? The next question I had was around just confirming the jurisdiction of district plans in terms of the vertical and the vertical extent. So you know, into the airspace and subsoil. Reference was made to a fetcher challenge case, which I have to confess I'm finding quite hard to locate. But certainly from a reading of the definitions in the Act, I think it's fairly clear that you know, subsoil, mining activities, all of those things are included within the jurisdiction of the District Council, as is the airspace above, although that is limited for aircrafts. So I don't know if you want me to prepare specific legal written submissions on that, or whether that's sufficient. But yeah, you know, directional drilling activities in the subsoil and activities in the airspace can be controlled.
I suppose it responds to one particular submission that I recall, was that from the center of the earth to the heavens is the vertical spatial extent of these site significance. So that's what we're responding to. So just the RMA context for that.
Yeah, okay. There is some quite good case law around the fact that, you know, the courts don't have jurisdiction to determine religious or cultural beliefs in that regard. So yeah, so okay, I can put that in the submissions for you guys. The next one was the scope for adding archaeological sites into one or the other chapter, you know, into a different schedule from that which is required or directed by the MPS. So I'm happy to comment on that. I guess we will be being a little renegade if we do it, and it'll be interesting to see whether that's challenged, given that those directions are mandatory. But yeah, I'll have a look to see if there's any wriggle room within that MPS to enable that. I'm also intending to respond to the Section 85 issues raised by Submitters Row, Houghton, Keat and Dombrowski. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong. And I think tied to that is the Maunga Haruru Tangitu cases, and the obligation on the court or the decision maker to determine the extent and the evidence required. Does that accord with your recollection of that?
Lauren, I just missed the crunch point. Can you just go through that again?
So I'll comment on the Section 85 issue and whether or not the extensive sites render properties incapable of use. And tied with that, as I understand it, is the Mongharuru case law that Sarah referenced, and the role of the panel to assess and determine the correct extent of sites.
Yep.
Cool.
Yes, I think that this came out of some legal submissions from Ms. Ongley on behalf of, I think it was Mr. Rowe.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, and it's about reasonable use and the weather section. I mean, it's not, I think she was saying that we couldn't make a call on Section 85 ourselves. That was something that the Environment Court was charged with doing, but she felt that some of the principles might aid our decision making.
Yes, and
in terms of reasonable use.
I think she's right in that it is a relevant consideration to challenge plan provisions.
Yes.
But so it is something you can consider, but I guess once those provisions have been brought into effect, then the remedy is the Environment Court, a ruling from the Environment Court. Then we get into this issue around cultivation, land disturbance, earthworks. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And you know, I think when the drafting was first happening, the plan is silent on cultivation, and perhaps that was because cultivation was seen as a subset of either land disturbance or earthworks, depending on whether you also permanently altered the profile of the land. But I appreciate that the fact that the plan is silent on it is causing uncertainty. And so it's a question of how that would then be brought in, and also what that means for efficiency, because if every farmer has to apply for consent for cultivation, it may, yeah, I mean, there's scope issues there as well.
Yes, it's been brought into further focus, Lauren, with some of the specific wording on the relief that Ms. Marco has introduced today in her diagram, which lists cultivation as an activity.
Yeah, that's right. The next question I had was the impact of non-complying activity status for SESMs in relation to designations and public works. So the section 171 and 181 considerations. And I had taken that from some comments you made, Commissioner Daish. So as my understanding of this is that you were just wanting to clarify what the impact of that status will be if someone then wants to go and issue a notice of requirement over a SESM. Yeah, okay. Obviously,
yes, because designations sort of go over the top of zones and policies that sort of become irrelevant. So in a way, well, not irrelevant, they have to be considered, but there's this extra power which, given the importance of SESMs, I'm really interested in, given the history of highways in New Plymouth District going through the middle of some part that we've observed on our site visits. So it's a biggie, but I think I know the answer, but I really want to be guided here. Yeah.
Because obviously in a 171 plan provisions do need to be considered and taken into account, and also any decision must be subject to part 2. But yeah, I'm happy to provide a little bit of case law and some legal principles around that. The next one I have is, I'm sorry, this is taking a bit of time. I'll try and go quickly, is the protect versus maintain and practicable, those words and the policies. And obviously there's some recent case law on this. The Tauranga environmental protection case is pretty pertinent. So I'll have a look at that as well. And then just that issue we just talked about before, the destruction and demolition and whether we can define it. So those were the legal matters that I had to address. And if I've missed anything, or if you think there's anything else I can usefully contribute to, please let me know.
David?
Yes, just one, Lauren, and it's apologise in advance. It's a little bit nebulous. It's in terms of our Section 32 responsibilities of ensuring that provisions are appropriate and they give effect to the Act. I wonder in relation to this topic whether there's any guidance to be taken from the wordings of Section 6E and Section 6F in terms of the tone that they set for policies and rules, whether they're on the avoidance side of the ledger or the managed side of the ledger. Let me just explain that very briefly. Section 6F, for example, is about the protection of historic heritage from inappropriate subdivision and development. So there's a sort of a inbuilt qualifier into a matter of national importance there.
Yeah.
Whereas Section 6E doesn't have that sort of qualifier. It's about providing for the relationship of Maori and their culture and their traditions in respect to their ancestral lands. So you either provide for it or you don't. And there's a direction that you should provide for it. And I just wonder if the wording, the relative wording of those two provides a statutory basis for potential different policy and rule approaches for, I guess I'm thinking mainly of built heritage on one hand and cultural heritage in terms of SASMs on the other. And again, you could write a dissertation on that.
Yeah.
I just wonder whether you could give some thought to that from a legal perspective, and whether in particular there's a little, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but whether there's room for some wiggle room in 6F that might not be in existence in 6E. That's probably as succinct as I could put it.
Noting that SASMs also fall under that definition of historic heritage.
Yes, yeah, that's the other complication, I guess. But just reading the two matters of national direction, national importance, as to say, at face value. Don't spend too much time on it.
Yeah, I might need a couple of weeks for this.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, have you look at that.
Thank you.
I really enjoy that kind of analysis. So
yeah.
It'd be good to get stuck into that question.
Yes, I mean, Section 6.8 could have talked about protection of historic heritage. It doesn't. Section 6F, sorry, talks about protection of historic heritage from inappropriate subdivision and development. So it must assume that there'll be times when there is appropriate development that means that historic heritage doesn't get protected.
That's right. Well, that's my understanding of it.
Yes.
And the job of the plan is to explain or outline what those inappropriate activities are.
Yes. So, for example, some plans have approached that through categorisation of heritage buildings into two different categories, so Category 1 and Category 2, and they have different policy frameworks for that. This plan doesn't do that. It has one list of activities. I think they're a mixture of 1 and 2 anyway, but they're all subject to the same objective policy and rule framework, except where they are partial, well, depends on whether they're alterations or additions or demolition or whatever. That's the only nuance, really.
Yeah. Yeah, this plan's treated historic heritage as historic heritage.
Yes.
It is what it is. And then it's a question of what's inappropriate and what's appropriate in that context.
Yes, and what the most appropriate activity status is for that, for historic heritage, compared to SASMs where there's destruction of a site. Okay. And whether there's a part 2 reason for a differentiation and approach between the two. I'll stop it there.
Thanks, David. I'll just quickly check in with Stephen if there was anything else.
I think you've just blown Sarah's legal budget. It was my only comment.
Fair
Thanks,
comment
Stephen.
too.
I'm not adding anything else. So thanks very much, Ms. Wallace.
Always endeavour to be efficient.
Well, I think that might help Ms. Ritchie and Ms. O'Byrne too. That sort of response. And I guess that's the other point. Their final right of replies will hopefully benefit from your legal advice. So there might be a sequential aspect of the delivery.
Yes, I think Joe may be asking about the time frame for these, but certainly I'd be supportive of me getting some time to do that, and then for you guys to have a look at that and finalise your reply after. But, I mean, we can do that anyway internally, but it's some more time than 2. I think ultimately we may need more than 2 weeks for this.
Yeah, I was going to wait till the end, but I just signalled that given the number of matters that Ms. Wallace and I haven't even started my list yet, and in relation to SASM and Historic Heritage, I was wondering if we could have another 2 weeks on top of the normal 2 weeks to reply. And the other reason I ask for that personally is because I am appearing in the Māori Purpose Zone hearing on the 23rd of March, and if initially Ms. O'Byrne asked for 3 weeks, and that would take me exactly to the day of my hearing pretty much, or very shortly thereafter. So it makes it really tricky to do some good work in terms of the written right of reply. But obviously at your discretion, Commissioners.
Okay. Just thinking about our timing, I'm quite keen for us to get Jo, because it's Friday, and I know Jo was quite keen, and I'm quite keen to hear her. So with your leave, Commissioners, I'm quite keen for Jo to present to us and complete her verbal right of reply before we finish tonight.
Yes, and I'm happy for that to be just a straight inventory, Antoine.
Okay.
And I'll promise not to interrupt.
I'll keep you that.
Okay.
I can only see one of your hands. Is your other fingers crossed at all? No. Okay, very good. Ms. Ritchie.
Thank you. So just to start with an overarching issue, obviously there will be issues that will need to be in both the Historic Heritage right of reply and this right of reply for SASM chapter. So we'll be addressing as many of those issues in both our reports, but also we'll be addressing the inconsistencies perhaps that have appeared between both chapters. I notice that there is an inconsistency in relation to the use of scheduled in the policies. Ms. O'Byrne has actually included it and I've taken it out. So we'll need to assess that. My feeling is initially that Ms. O'Byrne included the word in response to a submission by Heritage New Zealand, which didn't want to confuse the words listed and scheduled, and that was her way of responding to that. So the other option we have, of course, is that we could, instead of either being silent on it or including it, is to refer to scheduled and unscheduled sites potentially. And I haven't yet had the option to talk to Ms. O'Byrne to really work through those consistencies, but that's one of them. The other one that we have identified is that I had amended my first objective, SASM 01, in relation to submissions from iwi Hapu and the oil companies. They sought different outcomes, and I've taken my guidance from minute 9 and the changes that we made to strategic objectives HC1 and HC2 to make some changes to SASM 01. But Ms. O'Byrne hasn't done that. She's rejected those, and so we'll just need to assess whether that's coming from the same place and, you know, from the same sorts of submissions, so that we can assess how to approach that. It may be that I remove the changes in order to retain consistency, but we will be addressing that in our written right of reply. So I've tried to group the next set of things. So just to let you know, the policy consideration matters that we will need to address is that protect and maintain issue with guidance from Ms. Wallace and the hierarchy of protect policies. I know that I think it was Greymouth and Ms. McPherson for oil companies, etc., thought there was an inherent conflict between some of the policies, particularly policy P2 and P5. So we'll be looking at that with the guidance of Ms. Wallace. Obviously, we've already discussed today the use of the term significant public benefit. Obviously, that came, there was concern over the use of that term from Heritage New Zealand, but also from iwi submitters, Te Aotearoa and Taranaki. And so obviously there was some concern about that, and we've heard some legal evidence from Ms. Wakaira about that. You asked me to seek advice from resource consent planning staff as to whether they've had any situations where these competing Section 6 matters have turned up. I have extended a request, but I haven't yet received anything back, but that will be in our written right of reply as well. In terms of the use of the words protect and protect versus maintain versus practicable, obviously the evidence on the matter comes from Greymouth and the oil companies, and there were also some submissions from LINZ, I understand, in the heritage to the heritage chapter, discussing these kinds of things too. We didn't initially think that there was what would you call it, a policy block in relation to these sort of policies, but obviously the evidence has sort of supported those initial submissions, and so we'll think about that again. And obviously also the other thing we will be considering is the network utilities right of reply report, and there's, because as I understand it, there's a new definition proposed for practicable. I have had a look at that proposed definition, and I'm not sure it actually works for the SASM chapter, but there is still work to be done sort of around whether you know, we can even go there, because I'm just not sure whether the word practicable in terms of SASM can actually be used. And I just say that because obviously what's practicable for network utility companies, and I understand the significance of some of that work, obviously, isn't necessarily practicable for SASM, because you can't, you know, once the SASM is gone, it's gone. And so alteration of routes and things like that do come into the discussion there, even if it's perhaps not practicable. But in any case, there is some work to do around that. I've talked about the use of the term scheduled. The other matter that came up, and I think this might be more about, it was in relation to historic heritage, built heritage. It was Mr. Wild's submission and evidence concerning Otumaikuku and the heritage building on that site. He discussed and he talked about the addition of intangible issues to policies for demolition and destruction. And that was extended slightly by Ms. Wakaira when she talked about you know, significant public benefit being potentially one of those intangible issues, you know, in significant public benefit to iwi and hapu in relation to social and cultural matters. So obviously there's, that was an issue. that we thought we would need to address. And Mr. McMahon, if I could seek your clarification on one issue that you discussed or asked us to look at. You wanted us to provide evidence of relevant policy considerations that would need to be assessed for rules 15 to 17 and 19, I think recommended rules, and the best activity status for this, for those rules. Am I clear in it, just you're wanting us to consider whether the discretionary status is appropriate?
Yes, are they the rules? Are they the rules that relate to structures and activities on extents?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, thought they were. Yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether you need the force of discretionary activity status or whether you can ring fence the matters of discretion such that a restricted discretionary activity could suffice.
Okay. Thank you. So then I move on to some rules issues. We'll need to consider all the evidence of all the submitters, of course. In particular, I want to thank iwi and Hapu for their continued engagement in this space and their amended proposed rule framework, because I think they have taken some of our rule framework into consideration. I'd also like to thank Helen Johnson. I'm not sure she's on today, but she's a really experienced practitioner, and we would like to consider her rewording suggestions as well, potentially. But obviously I'm acknowledging that several submitters, including iwi Hapu and the Network Utilities and Heritage New Zealand and Ms. Johnson also sort of alluded to the fact that the new rule framework that we had proposed, recommended rule framework, was not as simple as they would probably like, and they were possibly not so, it wasn't as clear as they could perhaps seek. So we will probably need to do some more work on the rules and before we address perhaps some caucusing. So I'd take your guidance on that, and that's also another consideration for how long we've got for the right of reply in order to do that. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of particular rules issues. So federated farmers obviously expressed concerns about SASM R1, which is the land disturbance rule, and the absence of reference to cultivation. And obviously Ms. Willis will go away and think about whether those two, one could be subsumed into the other definition. So we'll need to consider that response. I also noted that Ms. Benson's evidence commented that it was the levelling of the land that does the greatest damage in a farming context. Ms. Walker herself commented in her evidence that some sites might be threatened by cultivation and other sites might not be. And I think my concern around that, or my reply to that, would be that's why the rules are sort of broad brush, because every site is so different. This is the tricky thing with SASM. So federated farmers also talked about financial assistance in respect of the sites, but and wanted some changes to the policy to describe these non-regulatory methods. And I'm not sure that it's necessary or appropriate to do it in the policy, but it could be that we find another place in the plan, perhaps the overview of the chapter, in which we can provide more information about those non-regulatory methods. I would say that I am trying to find out a bit more within council about what we can do and what we can say, because I'm aware that the Heritage Protection Fund criteria is being amended. I'm not sure if it's actually been completed, so that will make a difference to the way I reply, but I will attempt to do that in the written right of reply. Ms. Walker also, oh sorry.
Sorry, can I just add there,
yep.
To the extent that it might be useful, one way of approaching this might be firstly for you to determine what the intention is in respect to cultivation, and you should be able to get some policy guidance from that. Once you've decided that what that is, then try and construct the rule around it. So is the intention to control cultivation or not in respect to SASMs? And so that's really what should be where your focus should be, and then the how to do that should be then the focus of the rule. That would be my suggestion anyway.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Mr. McMahon. Thank you, Commissioner. Ms. Walker also referred to the Hastings District Council approach and provided, in fact, a copy of their rules around Wāhi Tapu. I've had a read of these. I've noted that they don't currently align with the national planning standards, and that section is under appeal in any case. But I take her point, and I've reached out to Hastings District Council in order to comment on this matter in the written right of reply. I haven't yet received a response. I would say that there are two rules in the Hastings District Council material that Ms. Walker has provided that talk about two specific sites, and they've got rules that relate to two specific sites. I'm just aware that that means that if those rules change or the site changes or whatever, that they would need to do a plan change or a Schedule 1 process to change that rule, I'm thinking. And I'm not sure that that's we couldn't do that for very many sites in our plan, I suspect, and it might be not very efficient or effective if we did. So and the other concern that Ms. Walker had was about making agreements between landowners and tangata whenua, and I had directed her to policy, I think 8 as it was notified. Yes, 8 has a note that promotes the provision of or development of access for tangata whenua to sites, and then discusses that it could be through formal or informal arrangements or understandings, including co-management, joint management or relationship agreements, easements and land covenants or access agreements. So in actual fact, there is the guidance there to allow people to make agreements between themselves as to how these sites might be managed. So that's my response there.
Joe, can I just make a couple
Yes.
of comments? Can you hear me, Joe? Yeah.
Yes,
so
I
Rowan
can.
Wallace is the policy. Rowan Wallace is the policy manager at Hastings District. He'd be the best contact point.
Sorry, what was his name again? Oh,
Rowan Wallace.
Rowan Wallace, thank you.
Rowan Wallace.
Yep,
Yes.
thank you. Got that.
And my understanding is that, yep.
Got that. Thank you. I'll give him a call. I have sent an email, but hasn't come back yet. So, and Commissioner Deisha, did you asked us to consider whether the riparian planting provision in SASM R1 is an appropriate method for preventing erosion. So we'll have another consideration of that. And then I wanted to just briefly touch on the Network Utilities response to the policies and rules. So my impression of the evidence put forward by Greymouth and the Network Utilities is that they essentially wanted to retain the notified rules and essentially retain the stance that they took in relation to their primary submissions. So they wanted amendments to the activity status of the rules. They wanted, some of them wanted to move the rules to the NU chapter completely, and others of them wanted to draft a new rule for new NU structures. So I feel like we're in a bit of a stalemate with the rules in a sense, because they haven't moved particularly far, and they certainly didn't engage that much with the recommended rules, except with the definitions. So the definitions that we proposed have been largely supported by both tangata whenua and the network utilities, which is great. And Ms. Carville of Greymouth did support the permitted status of the NU Works rule that we proposed when no earthworks are involved. So that's also positive. So there's quite a lot of elements of the NU rules as notified, or the NU rule as notified, which was SASM R4, that was quite old, and I didn't think any longer fit for purpose, including the volume requirements and the underground, overground assessment, and also the notice condition that tangata whenua still say has never been adhered to. And to be honest, we didn't get any evidence from Greymouth or the network utility providers to demonstrate how the limitation of the area, for instance, has been adhered to, or the notice condition. And it would have been really useful for them to describe how their subcontractors, if that's what they are, you know, undertake this work to engage with iwi. So it's hard to, yeah, to be guided when there's no sort of response on those matters.
Joe, I think it would be good in your right reply to actually state that in terms of lack of evidential, in terms of your overall recommendations. You can see that, because that sort of commentary is going to be very useful for us in our recommendation report.
Thank you. I will do that. Thank you. I did notice, however, that Greymouth, Ms. Carville, proposed to exclude redisturbance of an urupā from the controlled activity rule. And obviously, I haven't had the chance to discuss that proposal with tangata whenua submitters. I do wonder, though, whether redisturbance of an urupā can ever be a good thing, and would ever be part of an agreed underground activity in relation to those sites from the point of view of tangata whenua. So that's something I would really like to talk to them about, and will be also responding to in my written right of reply. So I'm just as a note, I noticed that the proposed iwi and rule framework does not include explicit NU rules, but of course their SASM rule R2 provides for maintenance, repair, alteration and upgrading of existing structures. And then the new structures are covered by their SASM rule R4. So I expect that they have included those structures, included network utility structures within those rules. It's not explicit, but it is. I think that's how they're managing that, their approach to those structures. So I will, yeah, we'll need to talk to them about that rule framework as well. And just in terms of the rule framework proposed by iwi hapu, it's really nice and simple. I really think it is. And the only concern I have around it, which I have expressed in part to tangata whenua submitters, is that it doesn't discuss the 200-metre rule for identified sites or sites that don't have an extent. That's one thing. And the other thing they don't sort of grapple with is, or they do discuss in their evidence, is that if we did remove the 50-metre if we added the 50-metre buffer to urban areas, again, that we would have to then go and engage with several hundreds, if not thousands, more owners in the city, in the urban areas, because they wouldn't currently know necessarily that they had, that they were within 50 metres of the extent of a SASM site. So my feeling is that that would entail a whole nother Schedule 1 process. And that's my concern around that point that they make, that it should be the same process across all zones. So I'll just leave that there, and we'll try and work with that in our written right of reply as well. In terms of definitions, obviously, Lauren O'Byrne and I will consider the definition changes provided by Greymouth in terms of identified SASM. They've provided some proposed amended wording for identified SASM, so we'll have a look at that. I note that the demolition and destruction definition has been raised, and we'd probably need some guidance from Ms. Wallace on how to do that potentially, but I do notice that again, Ms. Wakaira's evidence talked about referring to heritage values of a site, not other matters in relation to a site. And I'll leave aside the definition of significant public benefit because I'm not sure how that's going to go yet, or we'll wait to hear from Ms. Wallace on that phrase. So in terms of other broad issues, there's obviously the non-complying versus discretionary activity status for that destruction and demolition policy and rule. And I know, Mr. McMahon, you have some quite strong views on whether it should be one status or the other. So we will be considering that. That will probably affect the whole plan in some way or other. So we'd need to involve some of the other members of our team probably. The other broad issue that I wanted to bring up is the height of building issues. That was a concern of Heritage New Zealand. They acknowledged that it could probably be different for archaeological sites and SASM. And I take his point, and I also think the evidence of Ms. Benson was very clear that it's in relation to the view shafts to and from the sites that's the cause of concern potentially. And that could just be in the rural area that pertains to, because I think probably the view shafts around some of these sites has already disappeared from some of the urban sites, if not. So we need to just have a think about how we address that. I don't know whether we could amend the rules. We were trying to provide as much consistency between the archaeological and the SASM rules as possible, but there may be a benefit in amending the policy for archaeological sites anyway. Mr. McMahon, I think you asked a question about the fairness and due process in respect of new sites being added from mana whenua evidence. I think I've been pretty clear with that hapu. I've discussed this with where there is a new site that they haven't discussed with landowners, then we definitely have to include that in a plan one, a Schedule 1 plan change process. It may be different for the likes of Ngāti Rahiri, who said that they had some new sites where they have already discussed those sites with the owners. But obviously I just need to sit down and have that discussion with Ngāti Rahiri. But that's my general approach, that happy for new sites to be sought, but if they impinge on a new owner that we haven't already approached, we'd need to include them in a new process. So Commissioner Dace, I just wanted to seek some clarity about a point you asked about. You made a comment that there was obviously a tension between active protection and maintenance, section 6E and section 8 of the RMA, protecting SASM on private land and on Māori treaty land, and what is the pathway to allow this to happen. Could you please clarify for me what you would like us to check on that in that respect?
To be honest, I can't actually recall talking about section 8 of the Act, Joe.
It might have been
Yeah.
actually me that added to that, because I was, Stephen, because the issue is raised by you around, should we be thinking about the Māori treaty settlement land in a slightly different way to other conventional residential development? And I was interested in understanding the section 6E relationship, because it's about the relationship of Māori and those traditions and lands where they're looking to enhance that those connections. But also in a section 8 context, there's the principle of development, which was originally out of the Ngāi Tahu fisheries, but it's about that Māori don't live in the Stone Age, they live in the modern age, and they have access to the modern ways of living, something we've been talking a little bit about today, and whether the principle of development provided scope for Māori to reoccupy traditional places in modern ways, and should there be provision in the plan for that? That was the question, I think. I hope that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah, that's my recollection too, Antoine. Thanks for chipping in there.
And I suppose I was also reflecting on the Healthy Rivers plan change in the Waikato, although that was for a regional council to a regional policy statement, where the protection of water, or, the maintenance and enhancement of water quality was really key, but it also took into account that Māori had a development right principle where they were the last to develop their lands. And so this is a situation where there's been 150 years of farming in the Waikato. Māori are just starting to thinking about what they can do with their lands. It might have been in bush or significant natural areas, and they're thinking, oh, farming might be a good approach. And then they're saying, well, sorry, you can't, because we're all enjoying farming, but you can't now. So that was what happened in the Waikato, and I was just seeing if that's an appropriate response here.
And Commissioner, was that in relation to SASM on their land as well?
It wasn't. It was more generally about the right to develop their lands where they hadn't been afforded that opportunity previously. And there's a whole the confiscation of the lands.
Yes.
And a number of barriers that have been put in place. Which were all quite transparent to us, being put in place to stop Māori developing.
Yeah.
And you'd assume that many of those instruments were very similar to the Taranaki.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so there is obviously, as I alluded to before, Ms. Walker wanted me to find out about rates relief and resource consent fees rebates for those with SASM sites. So I will look some more into that and put it in my written right of reply. The same goes for resourcing for iwi hapu in respect of resource consent applications, because obviously my understanding is that we do in the next long-term plan have some provision for that, but I will try and let you know what that is in more detail. There was a concern, I think it was from Commissioner McMahon, that there was an issue of information being provided too late, a natural justice issue in respect of Mr. Luke Harris and his submission. So I will respond some more to that. Then there was just a couple of general questions, how the council goes about the process of monitoring consent conditions in respect of SASM, and also what is the go forward plan for the Wāhi Tapu review process and for completion of Schedule 3 information. So obviously you've probably already gathered that the Wāhi Tapu review process is not stopping anytime, and that will just continue on into other plan changes, etc. In terms of completion of Schedule 3 information, I definitely do need and want to sit down with Hapu to do that. I tried my best, but we just ran out of time to do some of the work that's required. So it's just about trying to determine what would be the best approach and how to go about doing that in regard to the district plan review. Some of the Schedule 3 information is minor in the scheme of things, but obviously not minor to tangata whenua in terms of names of sites and classifications, and obviously the mana whenua aspect. And I'd just like to note in that regard that setting aside a couple of the attributes in the Schedule 3, there's probably over 8,000 attributes for 1,035 sites. So it's not insubstantial to get all of those, all of that data correct. And obviously we need to do that before we can confirm the Schedule 3. In relation to that, Commissioner Coffin, you commented that we might want to consider the separation of archaeological and SASM sites within Schedule 3. That probably goes to a larger issue about whether we can separate, whether the archaeological sites should be within the SASM chapter or otherwise, and Ms. Wallace will be looking at the scope for doing that in terms of the national planning standards. I mean, ideally, I think that there should be some changes, but yeah, I'd need to be guided by Ms. Wallace. I mean, you could actually have a whole nother chapter probably for archaeological sites that are purely archaeological, and then have their own schedule. But whether that falls within the national planning standard scope, I'm just not sure. So that's one of the options. I think it was Greymouth asked to have notations in the schedule to indicate where sites have been destroyed. I haven't, the only consideration I've made of this point is that that could only work for purely archaeological sites, because obviously for SASM, the spiritual and cultural elements continue, and the footprint is the spiritual footprint of the Māori of the site continues on. So we wouldn't be able to do that for SASM sites. And I'd just note that 80% of the sites within Schedule 3 are both SASM and archaeological sites.
Just to perhaps share some experience with when I was on the archaeological committee of Heritage, what was Historic Places Trust in that time, and we were looking specifically at the issue of sites that where an applicant has applied for, it was an authority to destroy an archaeological site that had been granted, and they had, in inverted commas, destroyed the archaeological site, but the record stayed on the site record scheme. And so you had a file and had a number for a destroyed archaeological site, and in theory you'd have to apply for an authority to damage that destroyed archaeological site. So what we found was there's the situation, strangely, in theory, a site is never actually destroyed in terms of its record is taken off the site recording scheme. So I wouldn't want to get you going down a rabbit hole that you get to the end of it, it's another rabbit hole. So yeah, just be careful with that one.
Okay, thank you.
It might be a logistical nightmare.
Point noted. Thank you very much, Commissioner. And obviously the mana whenua issue is has come up quite strongly in terms of incorrect mana whenua listings and the priority or otherwise of mana whenua. We do need to clarify the mana whenua status. Obviously, that's one of our requirements, and obviously for resource consents in particular, it would be really good and useful to have correct mana whenua names in the schedule, because the resource consent planners can go directly to that. And also for tangata whenua, because they don't want to be approached if that's incorrect, you know, if unnecessarily. They have enough to do. So we do need to get that correct.
Certainly from my reading of the submissions and the evidence we received, that I haven't heard anyone saying there shouldn't be a mana whenua column. There shouldn't be the identification of the mana whenua. It's more about the how does this work?
Yes.
And how best might be reflected. Yeah.
Yes, and I think Commissioner Dash also asked us to look into how we go about doing that process. So we are, the iwi relationships team are doing that, I think. So we can hopefully write about that in our written right of reply. Getting into, there was some evidence about certain sites from Heritage New Zealand that we'd got some things wrong, and so I acknowledge those and we'll correct them. And this, I do acknowledge that site 2647 in Schedule 3 refers to the blockhouse on Otumai Kuku, but we don't actually have a reference to the PAR or an extent for the PAR site there. So we would like to do that in future. So I'm just notifying that.
Just a note there, we've received that further information from Heritage New Zealand, and I suppose I'm not wanting to give you extra work, but I'm just wanting you to be cognizant that the reasons that those sites have been identified, which may be larger than those that are currently scheduled, the reasons for doing that might be slightly different. They might not be purely heritage reasons, even though they're heritage sites.
Yes.
So I just putting that up there in my little post-it on the
Thank you very
virtual wall.
much. And I was wanting to engage with Iwi Hapu and the archaeologists to look at those. Yeah, because
thank you.
Yep, thank you. So just about coming to the end now, sorry. In terms of scope, obviously, I do need to look at the scope of provision of extent on some of the sites. So I will do that. And there is another matter in relation to the native reserves that have come through in terms of the evidence from iwi and hapu submitters. I think they definitely are not in scope in terms of their submissions as I read them in respect of the native reserves, except for one, but that comes through the Māori Purpose Zone submissions as well. So yeah, that is, in my reading, is they don't have scope to yeah, in respect of the native reserves that they've referred to. But I take that as being a process for the future. So yeah. So then a couple of last things, individual site issues. Ms. Gray's submission, obviously I need to consider whether how much of that submission is related to the sites on the district plan that she wanted to include, and whether we need to do further evidence in respect of those sites. The other issue around that is we will need the permission of the current owner to do that, to investigate and identify and be able to go on the site. So that will form part of my response. And we also need to discuss the evidence that she's provided with Ngā Mahanga Atairi, obviously, the Hapu, and who have mana whenua over that area. And you alluded to it earlier when you asked about further evidence needed from some iwi and hapu for some sites. And I will need to look for that as well, in particular in relation to site 177, which is Mr. Morrison's site. And potentially, hopefully, we may need to revisit a couple of these sites, but where we have removed the archaeology in relation to Mr. McCurdy's report, we would need some additional evidence from iwi and hapu to support a SASM listing on certain sites.
Just in that regard, it's been put to us quite clearly that the council's had a process and there's been some transparency about the communication of that process to tangata whenua groups. And we're getting late in the hour, or late in the day in terms of metaphorically and actually in regards to whether new evidence or further evidence can be received. And so I suppose just encouraging to say, draw a line and say, this is where we're currently at. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is the process we follow, and this is the parts that have or haven't been followed. And then that allows us to then make our recommendation.
Thank you.
Because I certainly wouldn't want to be seeing you, but with all best intentions, trying to scramble together and cobble together SASM, which may or may not be appropriate to include in the schedules at this stage. I think you just got to base it on what you've got.
Okay, thank you very much.
Without any further comments from the,
No, I'd like to fully endorse that. You do have to draw a line, a firm line, and evidence that you're relying on, it has to be evidence that the panel has been privy to in the hearing situation. So, and yeah, this is one of the points I was just going to briefly comment on that once you'd finished, but I'll talk to it now, and that is there is a fairness associated with it. It needs to go to the submissions of Ms. Waikora too, in terms of the robustness of the evidence. So yeah, I think the time has been reached now, and I think you've alluded earlier, Ms. Ritchie, that really the future Schedule 1 process might be the mechanism for dealing with this. And in the same way that that's been consistently the argument in response to Heritage Taranaki's requests for additions both on the built heritage and sites of significance to Maori schedule.
Yes.
So I'm just encouraging some continuity and consistency there.
Thank you very much.
Charles, ask just a question about your comment about needing landowner approval to investigate some more evidence and things. What's the council's process where a landowner just says no? Is that just the end of it?
It's just the end of it, unfortunately. We have to have permission to go onto somebody's site, and that's the case for our contractors, whether it be archaeologists or anybody else, including council officers and any contractors they take on board. And we need permission to do that, and that's why there are a few sites that we didn't get permission to go onto. I wouldn't necessarily say it's this site, but I do note that the owner of the property was extremely, quite vehemently opposed to Ms. Gray's initial submission. So we could make that approach, but obviously if we can't get permission to go onto the site to investigate it, we can't go any further, is my understanding.
This doesn't seem right in terms of these matters of national importance.
We've lost you.
It doesn't seem right to me, but this is sort of broader than that, in terms of a matter of national significance or importance, a landowner might just say, well, can't progress that council because my land is my land, and there's not other ways of investigating through technology and things. I'm just probably I'm barking up a tree here, but yeah.
I will consider, obviously, the whole way we've approached the Waihi Tapu review has been through non-intrusive methods as much as possible, desktop surveys and using the existing historical record, including maps and textual evidence and plans and things like that. But for some sites, we already have certain sites on that property listed as sites, as I understand it, and so these would be additional new sites. It's just, I'm not quite sure, that I'll need to take advice on that Commissioner. So the three last items that would probably be following the PDP processes, a protocol for management and use of sensitive information, the investigation of cultural landscapes as a process that we could include within the plan at a future date, including perhaps looking at the Nelson or Hawke's Bay Hastings approach, and a possible significance test for purely archaeological sites was also on my list, but I don't know whether, yeah, we have started the process of getting the policy person in the iwi team, iwi relationships team, to look at a protocol for use and management of sensitive information. So I can report where we've got to on that. I'm not sure quite how much you want me to investigate in terms of cultural landscapes or the significance test for archaeological sites. So I'd be guided by you on that, on those two things.
Just in regards to the cultural landscapes, I think what we've seen is that there's an indication in the plan that cultural landscapes is going to be something the council is going to look to in the future. And certainly from the submitters, certainly the iwi and hapu submitters, we had that they support that approach, and they've given some practical examples how that might apply to individual sites and areas. So I think that's all in the future, and those examples in the Hawke's Bay and Nelson, I suppose, are good to look at. But it certainly seems to me, from what we've heard from the iwi and hapu over the breadth of the hearings we've had this far, particularly the outstanding natural landscapes and features work, there is a lot of Taranaki-based experience that you can draw on without having to look too far elsewhere. And perhaps, Taranaki might be a leader in the country. Everyone comes to look at Taranaki's examples of how you do it. I'd suggest, just in regards to the significant test for arc sites, you probably have to jog my memory for what exactly that was, but it doesn't come strongly to my mind.
It was actually from you, Commissioner Coffin.
Yeah, was that to do with, there's the test of, is it an archaeological site or not, but does the value mean that it should be scheduled in the district plan? That sounds
exactly,
like me.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Sounds like an Anton.
And as to whether we needed a classification process for those pure archaeological sites.
To me, that seems like that's the next iteration of where you've got to in the development of the district plan. So you're in your second generation, and future generations, whatever they might be, whether they're a unitary plan or whatever they might be, those are the types of things a more sophisticated approach might go to. But certainly not looking to you to do much work in that area at all.
Okay, thank you.
Unless the commissioners have got a contrary view.
No, I have the same view. I'd endorse that again, Ms. Ritchie, but I think it's important that you capture these, albeit briefly, in your right of reply, so that there's a record of it.
Yes.
That the panel can then speak to it in their recommended decision, and maybe provide some high-level direction and guidance for the council to initiate some works if they were in mind to do that. And I'm conscious how these work, and sometimes it takes an external recommender to initiate this sort of action. So but I think it's important also to recognise that whilst these matters were discussed in the hearings and in evidence, they weren't necessarily have a firm scope basis for them to be dealt with as part of the decision making. And then the cultural landscapes one is a classic one. I mean, there's clearly an appetite for investigating of that, but it would be a very long shot to say that that there was a fair submission basis for that to be applied at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's
guys, I'm in the middle of a very active bar now, so I don't know whether you can. Joe, when you speak to Rowan at HDC,
Yep.
They're investigating a cultural landscape around Tamata Peak.
Okay.
As a new plan change. So there might be some really good coordination between, and they're a very similar council,
Yes.
New Plymouth, in terms of scale of issues. So there could be some really good coordination between the two councils. I'm looking at, planning methods in that space.
Thank you.
And I know that they're currently it's on their agenda at the moment.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Anton, I had 5 matters in response to that. One of them's already been canvassed. Could I just briefly go through those with Joe now?
Yes, sure. And,
Yes,
I
please
did
do.
recognise the word briefly, but yes.
Yes, I will keep it brief. The first one, I guess the main one, Joe, is the issue of discretionary activity versus non-complying activity. And you prefaced your comment there by saying that Ms. McMahon had some strong views on that. What I would say is that I don't necessarily have strong views. I have strong views on whether it should be one or t'other. I have strong views on the process for determining you determine whether it's one or the other. And it comes back to section 32 about what is the most appropriate provision to give effect to the objectives. And that's why I was testing those matters with Lauren Wallace about whether there's any guidance in part 2 and that sort of thing. But you would have heard me raise this issue in relation to SNAs, historic heritage, and now SASM.
Yes.
And you would have heard me refer to the Royal Forest and Bird case that I think Julie will be able to tell you what paragraph it is in particular. I think it was 92, where there was a very pithy statement about when you're selecting an activity status, how you should arrive at that. And it's about how you achieve the outcomes in the most efficient way.
Yes.
So if anything, all I would do is advise you go back and read that case, because it applies equally to your topic and historic heritage and SNAs. But I'm also conscious, didn't you have an addendum on this matter?
I did. I did have an addendum.
Yes.
Yep.
And the chair asked you some questions about that. So
yes.
I guess and you gave a verbal response at the time. So
yep.
That's on record. That was the first issue. That I've covered the new sites thing, and clearly, there's either scope or there isn't, and where there is, it's about evidence and fairness and process. And all I can say is consistency with Heritage Taranaki approach.
Yep.
Third matter was, the third matter was, and something we haven't discussed, but is there an issue with the rule that talks about erection of a structure within 50 meters to 100 meters?
There is, because that's the height. That's the height in relation one, and we didn't have it in the first time round, and we've included it back in in response to tangata whenua submissions.
Yeah, it appears in R9, R10, and R11. And one perverse way of reading that is that you're only captured by that rule if you're within 50 to 100 meters of a scheduled site, and that from 0 to 50, you're not.
Yes.
And that's not the intention.
No, it's not the intention. And I'm pretty sure that Ms. Johnson this is one of the matters that Ms. Johnson has brought up as well. So, yeah. Thank you.
There was a simple solution. That's just to talk about within 100 meters.
Yes.
Yes, because that was, presumably that's the intention. And that was the issue I was trying to get to before about what is the intention of the rule with cultivation? Is it in the tent or is it outside the tent? Once you make that call, then what's the best way of writing the rule?
Right, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. And just lastly, I was just going to say, I know you know this already, but just for the record, scope is determined by the notice of submission, not by the evidence. So, if you haven't raised, if somebody hasn't raised a point in their evidence, they can't suddenly bring it into, in their notice of submission, they can't suddenly bring it into their evidence. So
yes,
what I call creeping scope.
Yeah. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciated your summary. Very long, but yeah, on point.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Was there anything else, Stephen? Hey, thanks, Joe. I counted 32 points that you provided in your
I haven't
summary.
listed, I haven't numbered them, but thank
But
you.
yeah, that's really fulsome, plus the few extras that David did briefly mention. So just thank you very much. And I know this has been an incredible amount of work and quite complicated.
Yes,
and
very
messy.
complex, I think.
I'm not saying messy in a negative way. It's messy because it's lots of moving parts.
It has got
parts that are past, in the present, and in the future. So I just want to acknowledge your facilitating that role and taking us through it. So really appreciate it, both yourself and Ms. Wallace. I think we've come towards the end of our session, and there was the question earlier you made around timing of a right of reply, including the legal support to that. I wonder just with yourself, David and Stephen, whether we do that now or whether we just receive some correspondence from Ms. Ritchie and respond to it early next week.
We've tended to do it, Antoine, just on the hoof at the end. So I think for me, just that 4-week period, Joe, that you talked about, seems reasonable to me.
Thank you.
So that's 4 weeks, including the advice from Ms. Wallace.
Yeah.
Yep.
As I understand it. Yes.
Okay. So it looks like we're acceptable to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Julie, just catch up on our schedules, obviously, to make sure it's in our decision-making schedule, that updated date to the right of reply.
And there's a hand up for Ms. Marco. Marco.
Sorry about that, Ms. Marco. I'm just writing here. Sarah?
Oh, tēnā tātou. I made it out of the office, sorry, so I'm on my I'm just on my phone. I just wanted to add one further point, if it was okay, Commissioner Coffin and Commissioner Dash as the chairs. Maya touched on in her legal submissions around the significant public benefit, and we were looking to propose a definition for that. So I don't have it up on my phone now, but I wondered if it was okay if I could just provide that further detail to the panel as well. Just I guess to touch on, there aren't any on review, and with Maya's help there, we've found that there's no definitions of significant public benefit in a policy and a legal sense, and we think that if there was going to be a definition, that it should benefit. Sorry, it should benefit from the advice in TW11, strategic direction TW11. So that was only really what I wanted to touch on. And sorry, I meant to mention that earlier this afternoon.
So I was just to clarify, are you just referring to that particular direction, or were you actually wanting to provide some further information? Sorry, Sarah.
Just to provide some further information around it, but that I guess, the inspiration from behind the definition for significant public benefit would be taken from strategic objective TW 11.
Yeah, I suppose that the problem I have, and happy for the panel members to chime in, is at this stage of the hearing, if we were to go down a pathway of providing some time or some further information, it would probably be best done through a caucusing. So those people who have been able to, who've submitted on that particular part, would get together. Just in terms of fairness to all those who have submitted on that particular point. I can't remember offhand who's actually the scope of those who have submitted on that particular point. Stephen?
Heritage New Zealand was the other one.
Okay. So it might be appropriate if provide the offer to Heritage New Zealand and to Te Aotearoa to provide some caucusing, and which includes some further advice in that regard, specifically related to significant public benefit. David, I'm looking to you.
Yeah. I think there's a difficulty in just one party providing it. So, and if it's multi-parties, and I just wondered whether Lynn's were involved too. Was Miss McPherson? We asked her some questions on it. I don't know whether there was scope, but But if there are more than one party, probably caucusing is a bit more effective way of dealing with it.
Ms. Ritchie, do you think that would be helpful? Certainly there's a timing and a resource
Yes.
concern there in terms of.
I certainly think it is if you know, because obviously it's become quite an issue for that particular policy and rule.
Yes.
But yeah.
Okay.
And actually, sorry, just to add, Commissioner Coffin, that it was actually the scope is actually specifically in relation to historic heritage P7, so not actually the sites and areas of significance to Māori, but if that helped Ms. O'Byrne with that as well. Yeah, but happy to take your direction on that.
I suppose there's two steps there. One is just to clarify who's the parties who've submitted on that particular point, and then second, what I am hearing that it would be useful to get them together if they so wish to caucus on the definition for significant public benefit, and then convening that as soon as possible within that 4-week time frame. So, does that sound okay, Ms. Ritchie?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Excellent. That's great, everybody. That was a fulsome Friday afternoon. If you haven't already thought about dinner, you deserve some fish and chips. And if otherwise, if you're not fish and chips inclined, a fizzy drink of some description, or a still drink with your persuasion is well deserved by all of you. So I'd just like to thank you, everybody, for indulging me as the chair just for this little afternoon session, while Stephen's been able to watch and observe and pipe in as we'd need to. And thanks always again, David, for your assistance. So without further ado, we're going to adjourn for the evening and see if anyone wants to offer us a karakia, and otherwise I'm happy to close our meeting. That's enough of an awkward silence. Kia ora mai tātou, e mihi kawana ki o koutou, ko tai mai nei tēnei rā ki te whakaputa ngā kōru e pāna ki ngā sites and areas of significance to Māori, o tira ngā wāhi tapu, ngā wāhi tupuna, o tira ngā wāhi taonga. Hui anō he mihi kawana ki o koutou i tēnei rā, te moting o tātou wiki, i mua tā mātou whakatāno reira kia pai tō haere ki tō wā kāinga, o tira kia haumaru tō whānau i tēnei wā. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te urutapu nui kia wātia, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takata. Ko ia rā e rongo whakairi ake ki runga kia tīna, haumi e, hui e, tae ki. Kia ora whānau. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Thanks.